Montana, 1885. Frank Morgan pushed his battered Stetson back on his head and stared at the bottle of whiskey on the table. Outside his cabin window, snow fell silently on the mountains, painting the world white. Winter had come early this year. Just like the doctor in town had said Frank's end would come soon. 6 months, maybe less. The physician had told him 3 weeks ago, his voice low and clinical. The consumption is spreading fast. I'm sorry, Frank. Frank wasn't sorry. At 42, he'd outlived most men of his profession. 15 years. As a ranch hand, 5 as a trail boss, another 7 as a bounty hunter. Each year had claimed pieces of him. His left leg, crushed by a spooked stallion when he was 30. 3 fingers on his right hand, lost to frostbite during a blizzard in 79. The jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, courtesy of a knife fight in Cheyenne. But it was what people couldn't see that had truly broken him. The memories of men he'd killed. The face of his wife Sarah, dead in childbirth, along with their infant son 12 years ago. The crushing loneliness that had followed him like a shadow ever since. Frank uncorked the whiskey and poured a generous measure into a chipped enamel cup. No sense saving it now. He had enough ammunition, enough whiskey, and enough solitude to see himself through to the end on his own terms. When the coughing got too bad, when the blood came too frequently, he'd take his pistol for one last walk into the mountains. Better than withering away, drowning in his own lungs. The blizzard had worsened by nightfall. Frank stoked the fire in his small stove and settled into his single chair, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets open on his lap. Sarah had loved poetry. He'd never understood it, but reading the familiar words made him feel less alone. The howling of the wind almost masked the sound. A faint thumping at his door, so soft he thought he'd imagined it. Then it came again, more insistent. Frank reached for his Colt revolver. Visitors were rare in good weather, unheard of during a blizzard. He crossed the cabin in 3 limping strides and cracked the door open, gun at the ready. No one stood at eye level. Frank looked down. A child huddled on his doorstep, nearly buried in snow. A small figure wrapped in a tattered blanket, shivering violently. Large brown eyes stared up at him from a face blue with cold. Jesus Christ, Frank muttered, tucking his gun into his waistband. He bent down, wincing at the pain in his chest, and scooped the child into his arms. Light as a bundle of kindling. Inside, Frank placed the child, a boy, he now saw, no more than 6 or 7 years old, near the stove. The boy's clothes were soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. His lips had an alarming bluish tint. "Can you hear me, boy? What's your name? Where'd you come from?" The child stared at him without answering, teeth chattering. Frank cursed under his breath. He knew hypothermia when he saw it. Questions could wait. He stripped the boy of his. Wet clothes wrapped him in a wool blanket and heated water for a tin bath. The child offered no resistance, limp as a rag doll in Frank's calloused hands. As he worked, Frank took inventory. No visible injuries, but the boy was thin, ribs clearly visible. Dark hair, olive skin, likely Mexican or perhaps native. Number. Identification, nothing in his pockets except a small wooden horse, crudely carved. The nearest settlement was 15 miles away. No child could have walked that far in this storm. Someone must have brought him close then. What? Abandoned him? Lost him? Frank lifted the boy into the shallow bath. The warm water seemed to revive him somewhat. His shivering lessened, and color began returning to his face. "What's your name, son?" Frank tried again, speaking slowly, clearly, the boy's dark eyes fixed on Frank's face. His mouth opened, then closed. He shook his head. "You don't know? Or you can't tell me?" The boy touched his throat, and again shook his head. "You can't speak?" A small nod. Frank sighed. Well, that complicates things. He dressed the boy in one of his own shirts, which hung past the child's knees like a nightgown, fed him a simple meal of beans and cornbread, which the boy devoured as if he hadn't eaten in days, set up a makeshift bed near the stove, using his spare blankets. We'll figure this out in the morning, Frank told him as he tucked the blankets around the small form. Storm should clear by then. I'll take you to town. Find whoever's missing you. The boy watched him with those solemn eyes, neither agreeing nor objecting. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed him, his breathing deep and even. Frank returned to his chair and his whiskey, all thoughts of his own planned ending temporarily displaced. The blizzard raged outside, but for the first time in years, his cabin didn't feel quite so empty. 3 days passed, and the snow continued to fall. Frank had never been much for conversation, but the silence in the cabin was different, now watchful, curious. The boy followed him with his eyes as Frank went about his routine, stoking the fire, cooking simple meals, coughing into a handkerchief that came away spotted with blood. Frank tried asking questions that could be answered with gestures. Was the boy from town? A hesitant headshake. Was someone looking for him? Another headshake, more certain. How long had he been wandering? The boy held up 5 fingers, though whether that meant hours, days, or something else, Frank couldn't tell. On the second day, Frank gave the boy paper and a pencil stub. Can you write your name? The boy took the pencil awkwardly, making random marks on the paper. Either he couldn't write, or he didn't understand English. Frank tried a few words in broken Spanish, gleaned from his ranching days, but got no spark of recognition. By the 3rd morning, Frank had resigned himself to waiting out the storm. The boy seemed content enough, helping in small ways folding blankets, stacking firewood Frank brought in. He'd found an old checkers set in a trunk and taught the boy the game, which they played for hours by the light of an oil lamp. You need a name, Frank said during their 4th game. At least until we find out your real. If this story of unexpected hope is touching your heart, take a moment right now to hit the like button and subscribe to No Filter America. Your support helps us share more true stories that prove one moment can change a life forever. Gabriel leaned against him, eyes fixed on the page as if he could absorb the meaning of the words through asterisk sheer will. For the first time since receiving his death sentence, Frank found himself hoping the snow would last a little longer. On the 8th day, the temperature dropped further. The wind found every crack in the cabin walls, whistling through the chinks in the aging logs. Frank's cough worsened, each episode leaving him breathless and weak. He tried to hide the worst of it from Gabriel, stepping outside when he felt the familiar tightness in his chest, returning only when he'd wiped the blood from his lips. But children notice more than adults give them credit for. Gabriel watched Frank with worried eyes, bringing him water without being asked, tucking blankets around him when Frank dozed in his chair. On the morning of the 10th day, Frank woke to find Gabriel flushed and hot to the touch. The boy's eyes were glassy, his breathing rapid. Damn it all, Frank muttered, pressing a hand to the child's forehead. Fever. High one by the feel of it. Frank had basic medical supplies. Whiskey for disinfectant, willow bark for pain, bandages for wounds. Nothing for a fever this severe. He crushed the willow bark into a tea, but Gabriel could barely swallow a few sips before turning away. By noon, the boy was delirious, tossing on his makeshift bed, his skin burning. Frank bathed him with snow, melted to cool water, changed his sweat-soaked clothes, tried to coax more willow tea into him. Nothing helped. As evening approached, Gabriel began to shake with chills, despite the heat radiating from his small body. Frank wrapped him in blankets and held him close, feeling utterly helpless. "Hold on, son," he murmured. "Just hold on." The nearest doctor was in town, 15 miles away through snow too deep for his horse to navigate. Frank himself could barely walk 100 yards without stopping to catch his breath. But as he watched Gabriel's labored breathing, he knew he had no choice. Frank eased the boy back onto the bed and began preparations. He stoked the fire until the cabin was stifling, adding enough wood to last several hours. Filled a canteen. With water, packed what little food could be easily carried. Loaded his pistol and tucked it into his belt. The wilderness held dangers beyond the cold. "I'm going for help," he told Gabriel, though he wasn't sure the boy could hear him. "You stay strong. I'll be back before you know it." Frank wrapped himself in every layer he owned: wool underwear, flannel shirt, sheepskin vest, heavy coat. Wrapped a scarf around his lower face, pulled on 2 pairs of socks and his sturdiest boots. Strapped snowshoes to his feet, an old pair he'd traded for years ago and rarely used. Outside, the night was clear and brutally cold, stars hard as diamonds in a black sky. The moon provided enough light to see by, reflecting off the snow. Frank estimated he could reach town by morning if he pushed hard and didn't stop. The first mile was manageable. The snowshoes kept him from sinking, though his bad leg protested the awkward gait they required. Frank set a steady pace, focusing on his breathing, fighting back the cough that threatened with every frigid inhale. By the second mile, his lungs were burning. Each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. He stopped, bent double, unable to suppress the coughing any longer. When it passed, Frank spat red into the snow and straightened with effort. "Keep moving," he told himself. "The boy needs help." The third mile brought hallucinations. Sarah walking beside him, her golden hair shining in the moonlight. She smiled, encouraging him forward. Frank knew she wasn't real, but her presence comforted him nonetheless. Halfway through the 4th mile, Frank fell. His legs simply gave out, snowshoes tangling as he pitched forward into a drift. The snow cushioned his fall, but enveloped him in its deadly embrace. For a moment, he considered staying there. It would be peaceful, they said, freezing to death, just like falling asleep. Then he thought of Gabriel, alone in the cabin, burning with fever, waiting for him to return with help. With a groan, Frank pushed himself up. His gloves were caked with snow, his face half frozen. He couldn't feel his bad leg at all, but he staggered forward, one excruciating step after another. The 5th mile passed in a blur of pain and determination. Frank lost track of time, of distance. He walked because stopping meant death, not just his own, but the boy's as well. As dawn broke over the mountains, Frank saw smoke rising in the distance. The town, just 2 more miles. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. Breathe, step, cough, spit blood, repeat. The sun climbed higher, offering no warmth. Frank's cough grew. Worse, each episode leaving him weaker than the last. Finally, impossibly, buildings appeared through the trees. Frank summoned his last reserves of strength and stumbled toward the first house on the outskirts of town. He pounded on the door with a fist he could no longer feel. A man opened it, eyes widening at the sight of Frank half-frozen, blood on, his beard barely standing. "Jesus, Morgan! What the hell?" "Boy," Frank managed before another coughing fit doubled him over. "Cabin. Fever. Need doctor." Then the world tilted sideways and darkness claimed him. Frank drifted in and out of consciousness. Voices around him, hands moving him, the sting of whiskey being forced between his lips. Someone mentioning his fever, his lungs. The word consumption spoken in hushed tones. "The boy," he tried to say. "Help the boy." Whether anyone understood, he couldn't tell before darkness took him again. When Frank finally clawed his way, Back to full awareness, he was in a bed at the town's small hotel, which doubled as an infirmary when needed. Dr. Patterson sat beside him, looking grave. "How long?" Frank croaked. "3 days," the doctor replied. "You nearly died, Frank. I told you to stay in town where I could treat you, not hole up in that cabin of yours." Frank struggled to sit up. The boy, "Easy." Dr. Patterson placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sheriff Jenkins took a party out to your cabin as soon as we got you stabilized enough to tell us where it was. They found the boy." Frank's heart stopped. "Is he alive?" "Yes." "Quite. Seems the boy escapettering that first blizzard, probably how he ended up near your cabin." "What happens to him now?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. "By law, we should turn him over to territorial authorities." "They'd try, too. Find his family in Mexico." But ... double quotes, Jenkins shrugged. "That could take months, if it happens at all. More likely, he'd end up in an orphanage." Frank watched Gabriel tracing patterns in the condensation on the window pane. The boy had suffered enough. The thought of him in an orphanage, or worse, recaptured by Blackwood, was unbearable. "I'll take him," Frank said suddenly. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Frank, you're dying." "Doc says—" "I know what the doc says. I've got 6 months, maybe less. But that's 6 months I can give him a home." Frank's voice grew stronger. "I've got a cabin, savings from my bounty hunting days. Can teach him what he needs to know to survive out here. And after?" Frank had thought about this. "My old trail boss, James Mackenzie, runs a decent spread near Helena. He and his wife never had children. Good people. I'll write to them." Jenkins studied Frank's face, then nodded slowly. "I'll speak to Judge Wilson. Given the circumstances, he might grant temporary guardianship. But Frank, double quote, I know. I won't have low with him." Frank looked back at Gabriel. "But I'll make it count." Spring came early to Montana that year. By late March, the snow was retreating, revealing the brown earth beneath. Frank and Gabriel returned to the cabin as soon as the trails were passable. Judge Wilson had granted Frank temporary guardianship, impressed by character references from both Sheriff Jenkins and Dr. Patterson. The doctor had also provided Frank with medications to ease his symptoms, though they both knew it was palliative. Care only. Gabriel had blossomed in the weeks since his recovery. Though still mute, he communicated effectively through gestures, expressions, and the few words he could write. Frank had begun teaching him his letters during their convalescence. The boy had said, "Papa," twice more, once when Frank suffered a particularly bad coughing fit that left him weak and trembling, and again when the judge officially declared Frank his guardian. Each time, the word had been whispered directly into Frank's ear, as if it were a precious secret between them. Life at the cabin settled into a gentle rhythm. On good days, Frank taught Gabriel practical skills: how to chop kindling safely, identify edible plants, set simple traps for rabbits. They fished in the stream that ran near the property, Gabriel proving adept at the patient art. Frank read to him each night, not just Shakespeare now, but adventure stories ordered from a catalog, books that made the boy's eyes light up with wonder. On bad days, when Frank could barely rise from his bed, Gabriel took care of him with a competence that broke Frank's heart. No child should be so familiar with sickness, so capable of tending to the dying. Yet the boy never complained, never showed fear at Frank's deteriorating condition. Frank wrote to James Mackenzie, explaining the situation in his straightforward way. The reply came swiftly. Yes, they would take the boy. Yes, they would treat him as their own. They would come as soon as Frank sent word that it was time. That letter Frank kept in the drawer beside his bed, unable to bring himself to discuss it with Gabriel. There would be time enough for goodbyes. One warm evening in May, they sat on the cabin's small porch. watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Frank's breathing was labored despite the mild weather, his frame gaunt beneath his clothes. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, gesturing toward the view. Gabriel nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Frank shyly. Frank opened it to find a crude drawing. 2 figures, one tall and one small, standing before what was clearly meant to be their cabin. Above them, written in Gabriel's improving handwriting, "Papa and me." Frank swallowed hard. "It's perfect," he said, his voice rough. "Just perfect." Gabriel beamed, then pointed to Frank's chest, tilted his head questioningly. "I'm feeling fine," Frank lied, tucking the drawing carefully into his shirt pocket. "Just fine." That night, after Gabriel had fallen asleep, Frank sat at his small table and wrote 2 letters. One to James and Martha Mackenzie, telling them it would be soon. The other to Gabriel, to be given to him when he was older, explaining how a broken cowboy had found salvation in a mute child, and how grateful he was for these borrowed months of fatherhood. June brought wiles and thunderstorms. Frank's condition declined rapidly with the rising humidity. Dr. Patterson visited once, his face grim as he listened to Frank's lungs. "A week," he said quietly while Gabriel was outside. "Maybe 2. Frank nodded. He'd known, had felt death circling closer. "Mackenzies are coming. Sent for them 3 days ago." The doctor squeezed his shoulder. "You've done right by that boy, Frank. Not many would have." After the doctor left, Frank called Gabriel to his bedside. The boy came immediately, his expressive face showing concern he was too young to hide. "Listen, son," Frank said, taking Gabriel's small hand in his. "We need to talk about what's coming." Gabriel shook his head vehemently, his free hand pressing against Frank's chest as if he could physically stop what was happening inside. "I know it's hard," Frank continued gently, "but you're the bravest person I've ever known, and brave people face the truth." He paused to catch his breath. "Some friends of mine are coming, good people, who will take care of you when I can't anymore." Tears filled Gabriel's eyes. He made a series of rapid gestures that Frank had come to understand over their months together. "Don't want to. Want to stay with you. I know, son. I wish that too." Frank reached for the drawer beside his bed, removed an envelope. "I wrote you a letter. The Mackenzies will keep it for you until you're older, until you can read it yourself." Gabriel took the envelope, clutching it to his chest. Then, with deliberate movements, he placed it back in the drawer and shook his... "And now, we'd love to hear from you. What do you think this child's simple word meant to a man who had lost everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget, like this video, subscribe to No Filter America.